Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's John McLaughlin. I'm past president of the Beacon Sloop Club. Moved up here about 2004. Became very heavily involved with the Beacon Sloop Club shortly afterwards and a lot of its environmental concerns. Shortly afterwards, joined the Chelsea Yacht Club, which is right across the road from Danskammer. Heard the many, many stories of the past of boats that had to be wiped down every day because of all the coal ash and everything on Danskammer. I, of course, followed Clearwater's efforts to get Indian Point properly closed, but at the same time, I became very concerned with Danskammer across from my Chelsea Yacht Club, and the ash pit over there, the heating of the water, the number of other issues that Manager Greene, who is with Clearwater, has researched and is going to be presenting to you tonight. I was pleased when Danskammer was closing, but I was also distressed, as I think many other people were, because that plant was a very large part of the tax base for some nearby communities. So I was very, very pleased when an alternative that kept the plant on the tax base and made it a part of the new alternative energy thing came along. And so Haley Carlack with Scenic Hudson is going to give you an overview on that as well. And with that, I'll shut up and I will introduce Manna to you and let her take the floor here.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to be sharing information on the background to create a context. And that will include the history, Danskammer's history with coal and coal ash, which is a current legacy. Let me just be sure I can share my screen. And this is what I want to share. And I want to start from the beginning. That's it. There we go. Okay. Unfortunately, some of the top will be cut off, but Danskammer was built back in the 1950s by Central Hudson. And that was when the utilities in the state could generate their own sources of electricity. But in the 1990s, it was sold to Dynegy because of electricity deregulation. So all the utilities do now is distribute the energy that private companies, well, Central Hudson's a private company also, but it is specifically a utility that does distribution. The generation is done by merchant owners. And that was true since the 1990s. And during that time, Danskammer was burning coal and fuel oil and releasing 700 tons a year of pollutants into air, land, and water, and was designated one of the worst polluting facilities in New York State. Riverkeeper sued Dynegy over its outdated once-through cooling system, which was responsible for very large fish kills. And then in 2008, Dynegy sued the county, the town of Newburgh, and also the Marlborough School District, saying that they overpaid their taxes. And then in 2011, they filed for bankruptcy. And then we talked about the pollution. They were later sued by Sierra Club, Earth Justice, and others. And they had to add pollution control devices. They really haven't dealt with the fish kill. And then they also had labor issues. Labor is supportive of the Danskammer expansion, or labor is divided, but the IBEW and the Laborers Union are supportive of the expansion, but they haven't always been provided justice to their workers, including you see a picture of IBEW workers on strike to try to protect their pension and retirement benefits. And then in the coal years, they had two coal-fired and natural gas plants that could switch back and forth. They had two oil-burning natural gas, and then they had two emergency diesel generators, all of which really have contributed to the greenhouse crisis, the climate crisis that we've been experiencing. And they used 450 million gallons a day of Hudson River fish. And you can see the stats on how much they killed, both by entrainment in the system, in the cooling system, and also by thermal pollution. And that continues, but the new facility will have an air cooling system. So, just to include the pros and the cons fairly, that problem would be addressed, but many others are not. The coal ash was stored right on site. There's a hillside behind the facility, which is in a floodplain, and that hillside is a coal ash landfill, and there are issues with the DEC about some of the chemicals that are not well contained in that in the coal ash landfill. And I have to move this so I can see, sorry. The original coal-fired plant was closed due to Superstorm Sandy in October of 2012. And the New York Independent System Operator, which manages the grid and is responsible for reliability, that when you turn your light switch on, there is electricity to power it. They had written off Danskammer, determined that it was a mothballed facility. But the Federal Energy Reserve Commission, a regulatory commission, FERC, wanted to beef up the power generation in the lower Hudson. And the lower Hudson is the whole tidal Hudson, but in this case, it's the counties from Ulster and Dutchess down. And so they offered a very high incentive, a special capacity bonus. And that gave a signal to Wall Street to take this mothballed facility and bring it back, fix it up and bring it back. And out of that came the proposal we're facing today. And also at that time, Danskammer assured all the parties in the application that they would only use gas. They would no longer use coal. So when it came back online as the peaker plant. That means it runs less than 5% of the year. It's there to meet peak power demand on hot summer days and cold winter days. It runs with 4 methane gas-fired turbines, which Methane is one of the worst greenhouse gases, and it uses number 6 fuel oil as a backup. And it continues to in a state of readiness, use the ones through water cooling system. So it's still 450 million gallons of Hudson River water a day. And you can see it's close to 400 pounds of emissions. And it makes a huge amount of money just to stay in a state of readiness and to meet peak demand. And their profit is $10 million a year. So that's what that special capacity zone, the capacity payments are huge, but the pollution continues to be huge as well. There's a long chain of ownership. I won't go into all of it, but Dynegy sold it to Helios, and who sold it to Mercurio, and ultimately now in November 2017, Danskammer Holdings took over the ownership, and they are owned by Tiger Funds, a Wall Street conglomerate that is in it for the dollars. And let's see, that is a map. I believe that is just only 3 miles around the facility. You'll see some better aerial pictures, but the new proposal would cost approximately 400 million. And it would be a combustion turbine generator, and the size of it is approximately 550 megawatts, and it would run, instead of less than 5% of the time, 70% of the time, closer to what's called a base load facility. It would use fracked gas. I don't call it natural gas. I call it unnatural gas, because we don't get our gas anymore by putting a straw into a pocket of methane and harvesting it that way. And nowadays, almost all the so-called natural gas, the methane, is harvested by fracking. And that releases, has a lot of problems, but it also releases methane at the site. And we talked about FERC's Lower Hudson Valley Capacity Zone. Very few jobs. Jobs is a big issue, but 6 to 8 management positions and 25 approximately full-time operations and maintenance staff. It is not a huge jobs provider. There would be some construction jobs, but there would also be construction jobs for the alternative, which Haley will talk about. And then I want to mention that the FERC proposal for the Lower Hudson Valley Capacity Zone was very unpopular. The New York ISO was not in favor of it. Central Hudson was not in favor of it, and very few of the environmental groups in the region. I think that FERC made a big mistake in that the severity of climate change was well known, and rather than acknowledge that and have the Lower Hudson Valley Capacity Zone put that incentive in place for renewable energy with storage and efficiency, that would have been a valuable decision. But instead, they stayed what they called energy neutral, and the energy that was most abundantly available when they went through the process it was methane, was fracked gas, and actually, that's not a fully true statement. The most abundantly available source of energy is solar, and all of the renewables. There is more of that than fossil fuel or nuclear, but we have to put the infrastructure in place, and we're working very actively to do that. And this is also an issue of cumulative effects or impacts. This, I don't know if you can see this, but that is Danskammer, and then next to Danskammer is Roaston. See if we can see it better from. No, this is all Roaston. This is Danskammer. That's Roaston, and there's also Bowline in Haverstraw. Lovett was another fossil fuel burning power plant that closed. It was a coal-fired plant, but that's been closed since 2017. But Roaston and Bowline are still operating and generating megawatts, but also generating the byproducts of fossil fuel combustion. So what about climate change? This facility is located right on the shores of the Hudson River in a flood-prone area that has already been flooded out. And we'll send you these slides so you can copy the links. But I wanted to show you using Scenic Hudson's sea level rise mapper, what that means. So here's 1 foot of sea level rise at the facility. You can barely notice that, but it starts to get inundated with 4 feet. And then, oh, I think it goes this way with 4 feet. And by 6 feet, it is completely inundated. And the newer numbers are that by the end of the century, we're looking at 8 feet of sea level rise. But this is just in a calm estuary. But when you add on to that, the superstorms that will inevitably recur, this kind of flooding is going to happen much sooner. Many environmental and health impacts, particularly on the city of Newburgh, which is already burdened with lead in old pipes and PFOS contamination in their drinking water. I mentioned that the new facility would use an air cooling system, so it would not be as harmful to the fish in the Hudson River. But it will release more greenhouse gases very far into the future. If this is not built, and we believe that there's a very good chance that it will not be built because of the recent passage of a state law, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, CLCPA, is looking for 70% renewable energy generation by 2030 and significant reduction in greenhouse gases. So that we think is an Achilles heel for this project. But it would, because it's going to be operating potentially 70% of the time, even with better air pollution, it would be worse in terms of greenhouse gas and other emissions. So the bottom line is it's time to transition to a truly green energy economy with storage and efficiency. And frack gas is not a bridge fuel, and it's definitely not a climate solution. So that's a quick overview, background. And let me just stop sharing. There we go. And Haley, I don't know if we should take a couple questions. I think it would be better to save them. Make a note if you're like me, you'll forget in 15 minutes. But I'd like to welcome Haley Carlock, who has done, Scenic Hudson has done amazing research. And she's going to speak about the current lawsuit, or the current application is it's a legal process, but the Article 10 process. And she will also speak about the alternatives, which are very real. Instead of having a facility that's going to worsen the climate crisis, we could have a facility that is part of a climate solution. So Haley, please take it from here. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Manna, and thank you all for having me this evening. I'm gonna share my screen really quick. Hopefully this goes smoothly. All right, looks good. Great, so hopefully y'all can see my screen there. So as Manna said, I'm gonna be giving an overview of the permitting process that Danskammer is going through right now, and the timeline and what that process looks like, and then talk a little bit about what are the alternatives to this plant, what else could be housed on this site right on the Hudson waterfront in the town of Newburgh. So we'll start out with a little primer on what's called the New York State Public Service Law Article 10 process. It sounds very daunting and boring, process heavy, and it kind of is, but it's important to know about. So any large electricity generating plant that does not qualify as a renewable resource, so certainly any gas plant like the Danskammer proposal, undergoes this Article 10 process that's really a one-stop shopping for power plant permitting. And what that means is that all local and state permitting happens through this one process. So there's no separate seeker process, there's no separate local land use approvals. The local laws can be waived if they're considered to be quote unquote unreasonably burdensome. So everything happens through this Article 10 with the sole exception of any federal permitting or federally delegated permits. Those do have to happen separately. But while Article 10 sort of takes over all of the different processes one might typically think of a large infrastructure project having to go through, it does really involve a lot of in-depth review of environmental impacts, but also impacts on the state's electricity system, socioeconomic impacts, public health impacts. These are all taken into consideration through the Article 10 process. And very importantly, one of the things that an applicant for an Article 10 certificate to construct and operate a power plant must demonstrate is that their plan is consistent with New York State energy law and energy policy. And as Manna alluded to earlier, that really may be quite the Achilles heel for this project, which we certainly believe is on its face completely inconsistent with the state's new climate laws, which point towards phasing out all fossil fuel electricity generation by 2040. So the entity that makes the decision on whether to grant or deny Danskammer's application is called the New York State Board on Electric Generation, Siting, and the Environment. And this particular entity's only job in the world is to oversee these Article 10 processes. And the board is made up of 5 representatives of state agencies. You see those there. So it's the commissioner of all those agencies, or most often someone the commissioner delegates. And then 2 ad hoc members are chosen for each application from the community in which the project would be constructed. So in this case, we've got 2 representatives who have been appointed who reside in the town of Newburgh to also oversee this process. And it's worth mentioning that while the governor is not in and of himself a direct decision maker, he can neither just say that the application is not going to be considered or unilaterally grant the application. But as you might expect, with 5 governor appointed agency heads on the siting board, he does exert a strong influence over the process. Here's just a timeline that shows the entire kind of Article 10 process in a nutshell. There are many more milestones than just these, but these are sort of the most important to know about. One thing about Article 10 is it's a very front-loaded process. So a lot of that, you see that whole pre-application phase on the left side of the screen. That's been going on for Danskammer since early 2018. There's almost 3 years of process before the actual application was deemed complete. And right now you see my little red arrow there. We are sort of basically right after the siting board deemed Danskammer's application complete. They did not approve the application, but they said, okay, we've now got enough information that we can actually start the formal process. And so we've really just begun that here. And there are sort of 2 different tracks in Article 10. One is the more formal legal track, which includes trial type evidentiary hearings. And the legal procedures in this case are going to begin right now. It looks like in a couple of months. The legal case was slated to commence this week, actually on Friday. But just today we got notice that the application beginning will be extended by at least about 2 months, perhaps longer. But that case will start probably in the early fall, we estimate at this point. And as things stand at this moment, the siting board will be required to make their decision by the end of April 2022. That could be extended by a little bit, but really only if extraordinary circumstances are shown or if Danskammer agrees to extend that beyond April 2022. So that's really the deadline we're working with right now. As you'll see on that timeline, in addition to the formal legal process, there are also several opportunities for the public to weigh in. There's already been 1 set of public statement hearings that took place at the end of March of this year. There were well over 600 people who registered to speak at those hearings, and though they lasted 7 hours, only a small fraction, I think about 30% of the people who actually signed up were able to speak because of the time constraints. But there will be another public statement hearing, whether that ends up being virtual or in person, more towards the end of the process, likely sometime over the next winter. And there is also opportunity to provide written comments to the siting board, and I'll tell you in just a moment how you can submit those. So you see here that you can submit written comments through the website I've linked there, or you can email them to secretary@dps.ny.gov and just reference that case number that's there. That's how they keep track of these things. But written comments will be accepted throughout the pendency of this proceeding, but probably most important to get them in before the litigation part of the case concludes. So I would say, before the end of the calendar year, if you've got comments, if you want to weigh in on the project, if you would like to submit some research or pieces of information that you think might be relevant to the siting board's decision, you can do that at any time, and you can submit more than 1 comment. And as I mentioned, you can email that, or you can do it right online. They have a site where you can register and just click to submit your own comment. You can also go to www.stoptheplant.org, and we have a page right on there where you can fill it out and it will show up as a comment to the siting board. And while there is a lot of there are a lot of complicated issues that will be litigated by attorneys and experts, I want to emphasize that public comment from folks who live in the vicinity of the facility who will be impacted are just as important as the arguments of the experts and other folks who go before the administrative law judges and get into the nitty-gritty. It does matter the opinion of folks who will be impacted by this proposal, and they do look through those public comments, and it is part of what is considered in the siting board's final decision. So turning to a different but closely related topic, Manna, thank you for all your kind words about our Danskammer alternative concept. that Scenic Hudson commissioned and worked with a team of experts on over the past 18 months or so. And we started with the premise that, you know, clearly the state and the nation are moving away, as they should, from fossil fuel electricity generation. And you've got this prime site in many senses of the word, right on the shore of the Hudson River in the shadow of the Highlands, that's got this hulking, I personally think ugly infrastructure seated on it. And what else could we do with this site? How could we bring some of the same benefits, economic benefits, to the community that they've grown to be reliant on Danskammer for? So we want an alternative that's environmentally friendly, that's a good use of the site, but that also brings some economic benefits in the form of tax rateables and jobs to the local community. And so we went to the experts. We hired an economic expert who has over 30 years of experience in energy project finance in New York State and in the entire Northeast. That's Jim Guidera from Ghent Associates. He made his living for many years doing the financing, frankly, for gas power plants in the 1980s and 1990s. So he knows very much the thought process that power plant developers and investors are going through. And then to actually analyze the site, look at the constraints, the opportunities, the physical limitations, and what type of energy infrastructure might be appropriate. We went to a team at the University of Pennsylvania Weitzman School of Design and worked with two professors there who are experts in industrial design and landscape architecture. Working together, our teams of experts came to the same conclusion that the proposed gas plant is a risky choice. And when I say risky, I do mean environmentally, but I also mean economically. Even from a purely economic perspective, right now, given state policy direction and also the direction of where investment dollars are flowing, a gas-fired power plant in New York State is a very risky choice. And a bulk battery storage facility, which will be a very important part of the renewable energy grid of our future, is a safe, sensible, sustainable option that will provide a lot of the same economic benefits. So the conclusions you see up on the screen here are the conclusions that our expert, Jim Guidera of Ghent Associates, came up with in his report, which are that for the foreseeable future in the Hudson Valley, a gas-fired power generation plant faces numerous economic risks, and those include difficulty attracting financing. What may have looked like a good financial investment in 2016 or 2017 is no longer such. There are uncertain revenue sources and operating margins given how the power markets are changing dramatically in New York State. And in addition to those economic constraints, there are also the regulatory and policy restrictions. And perhaps most importantly, that is that by the year 2040, gas-fired power generation in New York State will be illegal. They will not, under any circumstance, be able to operate beyond December 31, 2039, which is coming up, though it sounds like distant in the future, sooner than we all think. On the other hand, utility scale bulk battery storage is an economically sound choice. It aligns with the evolution of the power markets in New York State. It's supported by numerous financial incentives. The state has set a goal of having at least 3,000 megawatts of battery storage capacity by the year 2030. Again, that's coming up quickly. And one attractive thing from a financial and developer perspective about battery storage is it's modular. You can build it in phases. You don't have to build it all at once. You can easily add on and make it many different sizes. So here's the concept that our team came up with in a nutshell. Here you see a diagram here that has two separate areas on the site of battery storage modules. We leave that front piece that Manna showed on our sea level rise mapper that will be inundated, or at the very least well within the flood zone within a few decades here. We don't want to put batteries there because it's a serious flood risk, but there are other areas of the site that are appropriate. And you see the two there, and it would be suitable for up to about 190 megawatts of battery storage capacity, which is well within the range of what developers are building in New York State now. It would be eligible for a number of financial incentives. And again, it would be financeable in phases, which is really attractive. You could do several 20 megawatt phases. You don't have to build it all at once if investors don't want to put all their money down up front. Each of those phases could support up to about 25 construction jobs, and there would be a taxable capital investment of about $115 million, give or take, for just the battery storage facility of this size. So you can compare that to, as Manna mentioned earlier, the about $400 million price tag on the Danskammer plant, and you can expect that this battery storage facility might have somewhat lesser tax income to the community than the Danskammer plant would, but it would still be very significant and would go a long way to helping to mute the concerns of the community of what would happen if Danskammer went away and Rose Tin went away. And finally, this is my last slide, and it just shows a nice picture of what might be possible on this site. And again, you see those areas with battery storage. You see that they're very well screened. That's all existing foliage. And because they're so low profile, these buildings are about 10 to 12 feet tall, that you couldn't see these battery storage modules from anywhere other than right on the site. And you see the outline of where the Danskammer plant is now and what it might look like with that being taken away. And I'll also mention that one other nice thing about a battery storage project like this is that it can safely and feasibly be co-located with other types of uses in a way that a gas-fired power plant certainly can't. So, for example, just as an idea, you could have in that area where the existing plant is, you could have a sustainable waterfront development there, or you could have public access, maybe an area where there could be a kayak launch. Those could all be uses of that riverfront part of the property, and you could still have those battery storage modules on the other side of the railroad tracks. Similarly, just to the north of this picture and adjacent to one of the areas of battery storage modules, there is a coal ash landfill that is in the process of being permanently closed. Once permanently closed, there are actually a number of options of what you could do potentially with that site, including build a community scale solar array there. Landfills are actually a great place to site solar if it's done in an appropriate manner, would again bring additional tax revenue to the community, additional green energy, and it would really be a win-win solution. So, you know, in conclusion, there are other options other than Danskammer. There is no question at this point that a new Danskammer power plant is not needed for reliability. Even the plant's owners will admit that that's simply not the case. If they don't build this plant, there's no concern about the electricity coming on when you flick your light switch or about brownouts or anything like that. This is purely about the investors trying to make a quick buck over the next 10 or 15 years while a plant could run. Rather than that, let's go with a sustainable alternative that can bring tax revenues to the community in the long term and be part of a green energy economy that's healthy for our communities and healthy for our environment instead. And with that, I will stop my screen share. And I think, Manna, do you want to take it from here? Do we have questions?
There was a question I just saw in the chat from Jan Blair. Jan, do you want to unmute and just ask your question?
Hi, Manna. Thank you. I was just curious about the amount of coverage, the percentage of coverage on the property for the battery storage.
For the battery storage, it would be about between 25 and 30% of the property. So there's still a lot of the property left. It's actually about 120 acres altogether. I think there's actually 3 different parcels that Danskammer owns that are all contiguous, and it's about 120 acres. And about 30% of that would be taken up by the battery storage modules in this design. And again, we wanted to be conservative here. So it's possible, especially as technology gets better, that you could actually fit more on this site.
Thank you.
Haley, it's John McLaughlin.
Go ahead, John.
You mentioned you specifically mentioned Central Hudson as being somewhat initially resistant to this. However, the Central Hudson that I know now begs you to join either their or someone else's alternative energy plan, and they are heavily into bringing wind and solar. And so I wondered about this, and so I've asked around at people in the state who get their power from other such companies, and this seems to be universal. And so can you sort of address where Central Hudson is now on the issue, if you would?
Well, I'll take a crack at it and then see what Haley wants to add. But the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is very clear about the goals. And I would say that Central Hudson and their parent company, Fortis, and really all of the utilities in New York see the handwriting on the wall. And there are certain requirements, including what's called a distributed system implementation plan. And so they have started to look at how we will move from where we are now to where we need to be by 2030, 2040, and 2050. And we have started a process called, it's the 7-county Mid-Hudson Regional Renewable Energy Implementation Plan. And we're hoping, NYSERDA has just issued kind of a request for information to each of the regional economic development areas to take a vague notion and make it specific, make a real roadmap, how each county, how each municipality within that county will contribute to achieving the goals. So I would say that, you know, Central Hudson, we're in active communication with them. And as I said, I think they see the handwriting on the wall. They haven't come out directly against the proposal, but I think 150 elected officials have. Most recently, the county executive in Ulster County, Pat Ryan, came out in opposition to this facility because it will worsen the climate crisis. He's got a young son and so forth. But he also did something that I think we should all consider, and that is say that all these new on-the-ground facilities, the workers should receive prevailing wage and there should be project labor agreements. And Clearwater certainly supports a just transition, supports the alternatives. And I think that the bottom line is we're in transition from 50 years dependence on nuclear and over 100 years dependence on fossil fuel. And when you're in transition, it's going to be difficult. And what we're trying to do is ensure the wisest transition, both for the safest closure, for the decommissioning of Indian Point, preventing further fossil fuel, and envisioning and implementing the renewable energy economy with storage and efficiency. I think that's a long answer, but let's see what Haley has to say.
No, I really don't have much to add to that, Manna. You know, I think at this point in time, Central Hudson, as well as the other utilities in New York State, are required to secure a certain amount of what are called renewable energy credits. And so, like Manna said, this is whether they initially liked it or not, this is the world that they are now operating in, and they've really had to change their business model to accommodate this. And the cynic in me might say that, you know, their hand was kind of forced, but having spoken to some of the leadership at Central Hudson, I do think they're genuinely embracing this. And though it might be a challenge, they want to move towards renewable energy, and they see that, you know, whatever their opinion on it may be, we're moving away from these large centralized fossil fuel burning power plants to a more decentralized infrastructure that relies on renewables plus storage. So, you know, I don't think, you know, it's not their prerogative to come out for or against particular plants, but I think as a business, they are moving away from plants like this and towards renewable energy.
I want to add one other thing because it's timely and we have, a couple dozen people on the call. That renewable energy implementation planning process that I mentioned, one of the things we want to do is work with Scenic Hudson, who has a solar mapping toolkit. And we're looking for municipalities that would try to do that mapping. Where's a good place within your given municipality to site large scale solar with battery storage? Where's probably not, but maybe if it was absolutely necessary? And where should it absolutely not be sited? Because we want to be protecting, this is an area where we have a lot of prime agriculture. It's an important part of our economy. And also, we don't want to be cutting down forests and filling in or covering over wetlands, et cetera. So we want to respect the existing environment and economy. And what that leaves us with is areas to build, areas to consider, but maybe not so good, sort of green light, yellow light, and red light areas to avoid if we're going to build out wisely. And I would say there's now a fourth category, and that is areas that would be ideal to build, but they're not near the grid. And this is a challenge that the Climate Action Council and the people that are essentially designing the plan of how to get from here to there are going to have to grapple with in a way that is just and fair. So I say this because if you think your municipality might be interested, let me know or let Haley know so that, if you want to try and participate. I don't want to make more work for you, Haley, but it's a great system. And I don't know if you want to say anything more on the toolkit.
I threw the website down in the chat if folks are interested. howtosolarnow.org. You can visit our solar mapping tool that I think Manna did a great job explaining. It's really user friendly. You don't have to be an expert or, really familiar with online mapping in order to get some use out of it. Let your town board know, your conservation advisory council, your planning board. We've also got a solar zoning handbook on there. A lot of municipalities are grappling with either developing solar zoning for the first time or amending maybe a code that's a bit outdated. And we've also got some resources for that. So, if folks have questions or want to learn more, I'd be happy to help you out.
Haley, I noticed there was a question about how to get the labor unions on board. I think there's some very good data out there on the rapidity with which jobs are being created by the alternative energy system. And I wonder if you or someone else has a site that gives some of the economic and comparative data on that.
Sure, there's a great report out there, and I actually don't have the website citation off the top of my head, but it gives a good overview of in New York State specifically, the number of jobs in the past few years that have been created, developing green energy projects, and how that compares to jobs in the fossil sector. So, we've talked to a lot of these union folks. I know Manna has, we have at Scenic Hudson, and frankly, they just want the jobs, whether it's a fossil fuel power plant or a solar facility or battery storage. They want all of it, any of it, whatever the project is, if it's going to create jobs for their members, that's what they're in favor of. And right now, this is the project that's being proposed. And so, if you speak to them, they'll say, I'm not in favor necessarily of this particular project, but this is what's proposed. If you propose something else and it's going to give me the same number of jobs for my members, I'll support it just as much. So that's kind of the conundrum in convincing the labor unions to take a different position. But I'll say, Manna mentioned earlier that Ulster County Executive Pat Ryan recently came out in opposition to the plan and endorsed our alternative concept. And he did so with kind of a handshake agreements with the unions that they understand that a plant like Danskammer in all reality is very unlikely to get built. And this is the type of project of the future. And they're not going to make any big public statements about that. But I think the membership is kind of realizing that they've got to get trained. And Manna mentioned the just transition earlier, which is so important. We've got to provide the workforce training so that their members can earn a prevailing wage working on these kind of good projects that we want to see in our communities.
We're trying to form what we're calling a blue-green alliance. Years ago, that was actually thriving in New York. And work with the Workforce Development Institute, the Hudson Valley Area Labor Federation, and IBEW and the Laborers Union. And even though there is somewhat of a division, for example, the teachers union are very strongly in favor of transitioning to a renewable energy economy. And IBEW has been training its workers for years. I think it's just going to take that conversation, just like it's going to take a conversation with Central Hudson and all the utilities. But if we use a collaborative process, the future we create today, everyone has a stake in. And there's a whole other, well, I don't want to get too sidetracked. Let's take another question. I think that last question was really a great question in terms of land use. How much land to, yes, Herschel, I see your question, and it's basically how much land to replace the 550 megawatts that Danskammer would generate. And I know people that could do that calculation in their head. I'm not sure I could.
It would be about, give or take, 1,200 acres of panels for 550 megawatts. But that is a challenge with siting solar as you compare it to fossil fuel facilities, is that you can build 550 megawatts on 10 acres. You can probably, not in this particular case with the Danskammer plant, but you can hide it a lot of times in the back of like an industrial complex. The neighbors might not even really be too aware that it's there. And so in some ways it's easier to site these polluting facilities than clean solar facilities. But when you look at the process to extract, transport, and burn fossil fuels like natural gas, the overall impact in terms of the physical footprint of that whole process and what it does to the environment and to public health is extraordinarily greater than it would be for those 1,200 acres or so of solar. But the physical geography in one central area is much more noticeable immediately to folks, and it's much more difficult to find a site of that size than it is to find a site of an appropriate size for a fossil fuel burning plant. So it is a challenge.
Herschel, did you want to add or ask another question? You're on mute. You're still on mute. I'm sorry.
Manager, Haley is still on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Oh, thank you.
Yes.
I'm concerned about the 1,200 acre figure. In New York State, I'm an engineer, and the photovoltaics only have a capacity factor of 14%. It's a very low number, very low even compared to gas plants. And also that is an average over the year. If you look at it in say January or February, it's about half of that. And data that I received from Cornell University, which has a 25 megawatt PV system, says that when it snows, they're getting zero out. So I think I would like to see the basis of that 1,200 acres. I wouldn't be surprised if in fact it's much greater, but let me see the numbers.
Manager, may I address that?
If it's much larger, we have a huge problem.
This is John McLaughlin. We're not just talking solar.
Well, I'm quoting Haley's numbers.
Well, but you asked the question in terms of solar.
I did.
But we are transitioning to a number of other sources. We are rapidly developing homes and industries that provide their own power. There's a whole lot of other things going on out there. And so to couch this strictly in numbers of acres required for solar, when you're overlooking the large number of wind farms that are going in, the amount of geothermal that's going in, the amount of warehouses themselves that are putting in their own solar, I think you have to begin to factor that in.
That's a great idea. Let's get them all down and see the calculation, because I'm a numbers guy, and I'm happy for any source of clean energy, be it solar, wind, or you name it. But let's see the numbers and make sure that you don't get attacked by people who are numbers illiterate and say, well, no, you were off by a factor of 10 or whatever. And also you have to deal with the time distribution. The problems are that some of these energy sources are very variable over the year. And sometimes some people think you can compensate one for another. Hasn't really worked out that well. So a real analysis gives me the total amount over a time distribution, and then I should compare it to what the Danskammer people are proposing. Also, when you talk about a 3,000 megawatt battery, normally in energy, we talk about megawatt hours. So is this a 4-hour battery? Is it an 8-hour battery? And what?
These were the concept behind our alternative was 8-hour batteries. So yeah, you're correct. It's all about megawatt hours that are able to be produced in the duration, and batteries are getting longer, but we use 8-hour for these.
Yeah, 4 hours is rather typical. And how many dollars per kilowatt hour are you assuming for the battery? I mean, are you assuming 100, 150 or whatever? It gets to be an awful lot of money very quickly. So among the things an engineer like myself would look at, what is the dollar cost just for the batteries? What are the dollar costs for the other components that Andrew brings up? I'd like to see it down on paper.
And Herschel, that's exactly what the regional renewable energy implementation planning process will do. It will do that analysis. It won't even just say this is how many acres. It's where are those acres? And all of those questions, and we have it recorded. I'm going to actually copy it down to be sure that it gets answered in that plan. We've been working on that for over a year. We're hoping we can get some funding so we can work with a consulting firm that has the engineers and can crunch the numbers. But we want to be proactive because, you know, when you had a centralized energy system where you had large generators and then you use the transmission system to take it to large, where there was large demand, right. That's a very different system than when we're going to have to use large areas, how to do that wisely for solar generation. But then, you know, where is it appropriate to capture low impact hydro, not build more, you know, giant flooding areas, but what, you know, look at the full menu of what's available and create a plan. We have the intelligence, and let me say that we never minimize the degree of challenge, both in land coverage and cost. So, you know, we'll keep you posted about the regional renewable energy implementation plan, but those are very good questions, very fair questions.
I think the gentleman has some of the expertise if he wants to join the process.
Oh, absolutely. I am joining it right now.
Great.
I'll also just refer you to, I mean, if you're interested, there's a number of white papers and roadmaps available from NYSERDA and the Department of Public Service. I mean, thousands of pages of reading on exactly how we can get to 0% fossil fuels from a practical perspective, a sort of environmental and community impact perspective, and how that cost is going to be allocated. So there certainly is not one great answer, and it is very challenging, as Manna said, and I don't think anybody would deny that, but there's been a ton of great thought that's gone into this at the environmental and community organization level, like the great work that Manna is leading on the renewable, regional renewable energy implementation plan, but also at the state level. And there's a whole docket I can send you if you want. That would be lots of good reading on this, and you might have some great input and comment on that stuff as well.
I'd be delighted to receive that, but I'm also, and I very much oppose to having any new gas infrastructure built in New York, because it's absolutely against the CLCPA. It's just that simple. However, one has to prove themselves on several levels, including in the engineering world. Now, and also in the social acceptance world, you can get papers that will give you so much acreage, and then you find out the acreage comes a lot in the rural areas of New York State, which are in an uproar because some of their home rule stuff has been stripped from them in order to build wind farms and solar farms that they're very much opposed to. So you have a whole issue of the conflict between reliability, renewable energy, and community protection. So it's a multi-dimensional issue of which engineering is one piece, but the totality of it, and I think Manna Jo hit it, this is very complex, very complex.
And Haley and I participated in a process that looked at solar siting and wind siting. And it was a very inclusive process with state agencies, with people who were opposed to wind, you know, and out of that came a consensus document. Clearwater would like to work with other organizations to do a process like that around hydroelectric, so that people can weigh in with their concerns and then figure out what's the best guidance we can give that industry, so that we can, hydro right now is, in terms of renewables, is a very large portion in New York State, primarily because of Niagara Falls and other facilities that the New York Power Authority primarily is responsible for. But all of this adds up, and that's the kind of report we want to develop. And when we run into an area where there's conflict or stickiness, then we hold a consensus building process that is evidence-based, that is fact-based, and includes the local municipalities and community members. So, you know, we're trying to do it all and do it expeditiously, because we have basically to 2030 to meet those goals, which are the goals we need for New York to make its contribution to what the nation will do. We haven't really mentioned offshore wind and also grid improvements, so that we can get the energy from where it's generated to where it's needed. And those are coming on board very rapidly. We're getting close to wanting to wind down. Any other sort of important questions or burning desires or things you'd like to? We will, I've made notes of, for example, information on jobs, the the Long Island Solar Roadmap, and other pieces of information. We will send those to you to share, and at some point we'll enrich our websites, to really focus on how to get from here to there. But I think it sounds like there's consensus on this call that Danskammer is not how to get from here to there, not another fossil fuel proposal on a flood-prone area on the Hudson. Anybody else?
Haley, Manna, Joe, on behalf of the group, I'd like to thank you very much for this very comprehensive coverage. All of you, make sure that we have your contact information. Information can come to you, and you sound like the kind of people that can give it to other people. So please get the word out, help people ask questions, help them answer the questions. Anyway, Haley, Manna, Joe, thank you very much.
I